thank you for the invitation, and thanks to Siobhan for hosting me with colleagues, your team in Melbourne as well. We're doing bits of work together, so it's really fabulous to be here. So this is my third week, and yeah, it's great. So today's presentation, I'm going to just give you a brief background about our research centre and our broader grouping in the social sciences at Leeds. Just to kind of always good to know, I think, because there might be opportunities for collaborations and partnership. So and this is our building here. This is the business school building in a former. It was the Leeds Grammar School, the private school. So there was, when people come visit this. You're in a church, which I always forget. We're kind of there's the old chapel. So it's a really nice building. But yeah, so if anyone's in the UK, do give us a shout. We do host visiting scholars as well, so do contact me about that. And I'll talk briefly about our CERIC, our research centre, shortly. And then I'm going to go on to give some background and context to the research, including a bit about the UK context currently. And then talk about the research and about the findings from our surveys with employers and interviews with providers, both in the UK and in Denmark as well. So by providers, what I mean is welfare to work, employability and skills providers, because I'm not sure who in the room is kind of obsessed with employability stuff like me, but just in case your interests go a bit broader. Okay, so at CERIC, this is an illustrative photo of some of us. I was actually on sabbatical when that was taken, so I'm not in the photo. But just some of the staff that we have. I think about 40 of us now. So it's the Work and Employment Relations Division, which translates directly to the Centre for Employment Relations, Innovation and Change. So we focus on research, teaching, and also knowledge translation into policy and practice. And broadly, we're interested in work and employment, basically broadly conceived, anything around that and labour markets. And then these are our refreshed research themes that we relaunched recently. And I'm heading up the markets flexibilisation and social protection one in particular. So there's lots more I could say, but happy to chat afterwards as well. But that's just a bit of an introduction. We do, as I mentioned, host visiting scholars. We have a blog, and if people can visit us, we love them to write. I don't know if we got you to, because you weren't actually officially hosted, were you? Well, no, you spent a lot of time. We spent a lot of time together, which is great. Yeah, you did, and I didn't let you go. I had to around, job centres and all sorts. So I'm giving you a good look around the UK context. So yeah, so next time I'll get you to okay, and then LSSI is the Leeds Social Science Institute. So we are, of course, education, social sciences and law, and the business school where I work. So it's I was up in University of Queensland a couple of weeks ago, where we've got a strategic partnership with ISSR there. But unlike the guys there, we don't have a physical building. We're more of a virtual grouping. But we focus a lot on impact and research impact, and we have some significant funding from the Major Research Council to do that. And we also focus a lot on training and capacity building as well, particularly around methods. So it's a really good thing to be involved with. And again, we've actually got Greg Marston and Mark Weston coming over in the autumn. So again, happy to host colleagues from here too. Okay, so just a bit of detail about the UK context without wanting to depress anyone. And I'm not going to talk about Brexit because it's too horrible. And yeah, who knows? I can't predict what's going to happen, but it doesn't sound good whichever way we package it up. But you probably know that we've had contracting out since the 2000s in the UK, contracting out of employment services. And this really accelerated with the work programme from 2011 to 2017, which was a programme of around 420 million per year. And this was, I think I've got a map on the next page. This was a prime provider model that we moved towards. So the UK was divided up into 18 contract package areas, and in each area there were two competing providers at least. So they were assigned a caseload of job seekers, and they were basically competing with each other to get them into work. In areas like London, Manchester, Birmingham, there were actually 3 competing providers as well. And then so London, you ended up actually having 6 altogether because of the East and West London. So it was quite interesting, to say the least. And you might recognise some of the names here as having representation here in the Australian welfare to work context as well, that kind of global footprint of welfare to work. So we had all of these providers, and in turn they built their own supply chains, sometimes up to about 100. I didn't actually counting up some of these supply chains, so sometimes up to 100 organisations involved, and we have these tier 1 contracts with guaranteed numbers of job seekers, and tier 2, which was kind of more call-off contracts, and typically your non-profits were at the second tier. So that was a real issue in the sense of how the third sector non-profits have been quite decimated essentially with the prime provider model that we moved towards, because they were just not getting the guarantees of numbers. They were what was called bid candy at one point. They were put on the contract applications to make, talking a negative sense, but yeah, there was lots of accusations that they'd been put on there to kind of give that sheen of specialism, but actually didn't have the central role that actually they perhaps should have done. So things are changing slightly at the moment, because we've got now the Work and Health Programme, which is, as you see, a considerably reduced amount of money, considerably reduced amount of providers as well. And it's hard to tell currently whether we're seeing the non-profits actually coming up into their own again. But certainly what we've seen is the non-profits merging, like Shore Trust, which is one of the providers, which I'll just go to the list. Oh no, I'm sorry, I haven't got the list on this slide, but I have got a list which includes Shore. There's basically 6 contract package areas for work and health, and Shore Trust is one of the prime providers, and that was a result of mergers and acquisitions. So what we're finding is that the non-profits have actually merged and are almost kind of mimicking the private providers in order to compete in the market. So quite interesting. And the other interesting development is what I call quasi-Devo, which is basically that in Manchester, London, and Manchester and London first have actually got devolved deals with central government in that they've got elected mayors, because that was part of the arrangement that they had to have an elected mayor, and then they've in turn got responsibility for devolved employment and skills initiatives, so they can actually directly contract their own. I know, Siobhan, you went to the one in Manchester, didn't you, when you were over? So they're quite interesting to watch, and also we've got kind of other quasi-devolved areas like West Midlands, Sheffield, but there's not. It's Manchester and London really that are the key ones that have got the direct responsibility for contracting. So it's a bit of a complicated picture, I guess, is what I'm saying, because in turn, obviously, we've got Scotland and Wales with the devolved administrations, also in Scotland as well, and we've got the nationally contracted programmes as well as the kind of more devolved dimensions as well. So really working at different scales here. And I suppose some similarities then in terms of the Commonwealth and states footprints here. And then we have universal credits, which I'm guessing you may have heard about over here. Yeah. So maybe what you've heard about it is probably quite negative, because it's had a lot of bumps in the road, let's say, and it has been it's pretty much almost at pretty much full rollout now. And so now it's a case of the DWP, Bulk Work and Pension, they're trying to finesse what they want to do with their in-work progression claim and commitment. So that's basically this uncharted territory, as if universal credit wasn't uncharted territory enough. We've also got this in-work progression, which currently is defined by Treasury, who hold the purse strings, as progression in terms of more hours. So if someone's in work, they have to try to take on more hours, get above an income threshold. But it isn't progression like I would think of it, as a sort of human resource management, sort of teaching human resource management. I say to my students, we talk about progression, and that's not how we think about progression. So they're still trying to work this one out, and also decide, it used to be called in-work conditionality, so trying to work out to what extent it's going to be conditional and what the sanctions are going to be. And this all comes under the banner of kind of agile and test and learn approaches as well. So essentially kind of rolling things out and then testing them and fixing them, rather than kind of taking an evidence-based approach in the first place, which is quite an interesting dynamic. And then in the context of all of this, we've got a refreshed role for Job Centre Plus, the public employment service. So whereas under work programme, Job Centre Plus was really residualised in terms of it dealt with people who were short-term unemployed pre-work programme and people who were still unemployed at the end of work programme. But now we've got the role of work coaches as part of universal credit as well. And again, DWP haven't fully fleshed out what the work coaches are doing, particularly around the in-work progression aspects. So there's a lot that's still a bit vague, I'd say. And the other thing to point out was that when work programme was going, it was for the long-term unemployed, and I didn't point out at the beginning, sorry, and those at risk of long-term unemployment, as well as those assessed as fit for work who had a disability or long-term health problem. But it wasn't the only game in town, as I will come back to when I talk about our employer engagement, in that it was supposed to be a single welfare to work programme, but actually there was a proliferation of different programmes, including at the different scales that I've mentioned, the kind of local authority level, and sometimes like the Welsh Government, for example, ran their own programmes. As it was partly political, partly practical, because they weren't happy with what was coming out of the Westminster centralised contracts. So you sort of saw this, in addition to the competition in the work programme itself, an additional competition as well, if you like, with programmes in particular areas. So, as we may know, actually labour market programmes are really characterised by what Peck has called a supply-side fundamentalism, that basically there's been a lot of focus on the people who are unemployed, and including in a lot of social policy research, and quite rightly that we focus on people and their experiences of programmes, but what we really don't know a lot about is the demand side. And now we're starting to see some studies emerging, including work that we've done in the UK, and other people, in Australia and also in the US and in the Netherlands. We're starting to see a bit more work being done on the demand side. So we started off by doing an evidence review, both policy reports and academic literature, to see what was out there. And we kind of mapped out, so this is slightly messy, but you'll see it if you go to the report that we wrote back. It's a policy report from 2005, just at the sort of start of the UK-Denmark comparison. So we tried to map out what were the sort of key typologies that had been developed, and they seem to be split down the middle in terms of the extent of participation and trying to measure employee participation, and the other side of the coin was the reasons for participation. There was a whole kind of proliferation, and some of the types, as you can see if you look in more detail in the report, were kind of not that clear really, like Coleman et al. This was a DWP evaluation report, what is meant by altruistic and what is meant by strategic. So we felt there was a lot that needed to be unpacked here, and obviously a lot more empirical data as well that needed to be collected as part of all of this. So one point I'd make was that in the policy literature, but also in policy reports and government documents for employability and skills provision, there's a lot talked about in terms of participation, involvement, and engagement when it comes to employers, with quite a lot of a bit vague about what each of these terms actually means. And we found in the early stages this quote from Cooper, McGinnon, and Garside quite helpful in terms of just suggesting what employer engagement might mean. And then more recently, we've moved. This was a special issue we did for the Human Resource Management Journal about employer engagement. So the first time it had really been looked at, certainly from a human resource management perspective. And our argument in that special issue in the introduction was that we were really trying to bring to the attention of human resource management scholars this area of kind of what's called vulnerable groups, which is a bit of a contested phrase, but basically we're kind of talking in the HRM language, because HRM tends to deal a lot with, let's say, more privileged workers, professionals, occupations. So we were really trying to say, actually, one of the arguments is that if organisations are looking to diversify and become more inclusive, which we see a lot in the HRM literature, then labour market programmes, labour market intermediaries like providers are really key to all of this. And if businesses are struggling to recruit, maybe they should be looking more carefully at what they're actually doing, which takes us into the kind of recruitment and selection space, a point that I'll come back to later. So our evidence base then it's essentially 3 projects. So we did a survey of businesses in conjunction with the Chamber of Commerce, and we did interviews with providers of the work programme in the fairly early stages of that. And as I say, providers of other programmes as well as work programme, because many of the providers actually had a number of different contracts, which included employability and skills. And then we did a project that was a survey of businesses in conjunction with one of the primes. And then finally, we got onto a UK-Denmark comparison, which was essentially bringing together what we call the 2 faces of employer engagement. So from this first project, we started to think that actually it wasn't just about employers being engaged in programs and affecting a change in behaviour and seeing a change in their behaviour. It was also about the activities of people on the ground and providing organisations actually engaging employers. So it's a kind of 2-way piece, really. So yeah, moving on to our the 2 faces kind of argument, which is published in Journal of Social Policy a few years ago. We found that a small percentage of employers had actually recruited from the work programme, which we found that was quite surprising, to be honest, because in that Chamber of Commerce there was actually someone seconded from the Department for Work and Pensions, Job Centre Plus. So we felt that actually we had a good opportunity with this chamber to maybe get in touch with employers, and this was one of piggybacking onto their regular labour market studies, basically their labour market outlook. So they get a good response rate, but essentially we found that there was very little what you'd call participation, engagement, and it was at that stage that we were really trying to develop, what is participation, what is engagement. And we also pointed out, particularly because we link with the chamber, that actually we've got this context of very weak business interest organisations. And this goes back to the seminal work of Kathy Jo Martin and Dwayne Swank in the US, who did a comparison of the UK and Denmark at the time of the UK's New Deal. So 2001 was the time that they undertook their data collection. And what they found was that there was a really big difference between the employer participation in Denmark and the UK. So Denmark, employer participation was really high. UK, it was very low. But also what they argued quite strongly was that business organisations, employer associations were really important to the Danish model, but not important to the UK model. So this has kind of underpinned quite a lot of our analysis as well, including our recent analysis that I'll get onto later with our social network analysis that we did. But we started to argue here, and this is something I still would argue, that within the policy, especially the supply side policy of active labour market policy, is this implicit assumption really about what employers want, what employers need, and also their propensity to engage as well. Particularly as we were saying at the event with the Victorian government yesterday, I made the point that because we have a lot of this very negative rhetoric around unemployed people in the UK, particularly over the last 10 years, but going back a bit longer, there's that kind of line where the government is saying these people are really problematic, but on the other hand saying, well, actually, we're expecting employers to employ them. So there's a really kind of flawed logic there. So we then went on to our UK-Denmark comparison, but I'll just pause for a moment just to see whether there are any questions or points for clarification at this point.
Just a comment, the share of employers engaging with the job active system here is similarly. It would be around the same.
Right, yeah. And that are 5%, actually, there were a couple of other studies at the time. One was done it was contracted by government, and another was done by the CIPD, the Institute for Personnel HR. And so it was a very similar low number actually as well. So I guess ours was pretty comparable. But I think, yes, I don't know how candid the government is or department is about the low participation rate of employers here, because in the UK they do get very defensive if you suggest that maybe they're not doing as well as they could do. So that's something constantly, softly approach to try and get the findings into policy and practice. But some people are more receptive than others, really. It's kind of getting someone to really acknowledge that there's an issue in the first place that is part of the problem. So we started off with a phone survey. So this was done by a market research company that we contracted. So it was kind of computer assisted telephone interviewing. It was establishment level, and it was with the person responsible for recruitment in that establishment. And we oversampled sectors that we thought from the evidence, the data so far, were more likely to recruit from programs, because we didn't want to end up with really low numbers again, because we actually wanted to try to talk to a mixture of employers who had used programs and those who hadn't. So we oversampled, as you can imagine, retail, hospitality, and what's the other one? And logistics as well, because the sort of transport, warehousing kind of jobs very, very popular. So this is, so you can't see this very well, but I'll get up the main headlines. So this was employer participation to start off. So we're not kind of claiming engagement at this stage. This is purely a measure of participation. So we've got here participation in the main, so VIX on the Health Practic is the enterprise training in Denmark. That's kind of time limited, and the other main program is Langtidsskole, which is the wage subsidised job. So they're the main programs that, from economic evaluations, the Danish ministry say are most successful in reducing rates of unemployment. Though I do have a question about the amount of churn, which I haven't yet got to the bottom of, in that they don't seem to have data on that, I'm told, in the Danish context, but I do have concerns about that. And then in the UK, a mixture really, so sector-based work academies were in partnership with Job Centre Plus programs in partnership with employers. So for particular sectors, like they do contact centre or they do retail, and they work for a particular employer. So you could, I've called it co-production as one example of actually working with employers to look at their requirements. And then apprenticeships is in there, which it wasn't going to be at the start, but it ended up that employers knew a lot more about apprenticeships than they did about other employability programs, which you think is maybe quite obvious in a sense, because the UK government has been really pushing apprenticeships and the target for apprenticeships. And let's face it, apprenticeships as a kind of panacea, which obviously they're not, because there's a threshold level of qualification you need to do an apprenticeship. So before you even get to that, you need to do a traineeship. So lots of issues there. But essentially the headline finding is that we found the participation level across the two countries was clearly very similar. So not the marked difference that Martin and Swank found. Yeah, sorry, yeah.
Do you look at, do any of your providers in that case, in those case studies, look at providing multiple streams, so different combinations
of programs? Oh, do you mean streams of job seekers?
Streams of job seekers or streams of different interventions.
Yeah.
Work well together.
Yeah, we haven't, I guess we haven't looked at it, strictly speaking, like that, because we don't have the JSCI, so we don't split them into the streams like you do, so it is slightly different. But we are working in our cluster analysis and really trying to sort of decode what this means, because clearly in each country there are different instruments that have a particular target group. Though, like in the UK for Work programme, it was quite broad. It was basically long-term unemployed at risk of or disabled, but not, or long-term health problems, but not eligible for work choice, which was a voluntary programme. Yeah, does that help to explain?
Yeah, I'm just sort of
in
terms of personalised medicines. People have, you take multiple, have a bit of column A, a bit of column B, to address the individual barriers.
But it may explain a bit more when we come to the cluster analysis. But yeah, we can talk about that at the end, because that's a good question, a good way of dividing it up. Because how we did it in terms of asking employers was, we asked them about the programs, but we also asked them in different ways about, have you taken a subsidy to employ someone, because inevitably the employers wouldn't always know. They might not know they'd even had somebody via a program until, like, for example, a work program provider phoned them up to say, just finding out whether they're still working there, and they'd be kind of like, no, they were from the program in the first place. So there is that issue there, but also they might not know that they come from a program of a particular name, and that's something we definitely found, as I'll come on to say, was that the relationship with employers was so key. The personal relationship between the employer engagement person and the provider and the employer. So what we were finding from the employers and from the providers was it was about, you know, John, who services my requirements. It wasn't kind of, I know John, he works for Ingeus, and, you know, they knew about the programs. So that's quite an interesting aspect as well. And I suppose important that maybe it doesn't matter if employers know about the programs or not. And that's again a point I'll return to in terms of how government and policymakers present programs to employers. So we've got, now moving on to our measurement. So this is our composite measure using latent class analysis of employer engagement. So here we attempted to provide a more nuanced measure of employer engagement. But yes, it dealt with participation, but it also dealt with take-up of what we call human resource related services, including pre-employment training, support with recruitment and selection, as well as post-placement support. And then the recruitment as well. So we were trying to get there to a kind of more systematic and nuanced measure of employee engagement. And I'll just present this slide first, just in terms of theorising what it was we were trying to do and what I think we achieved. There was still kind of, we're still writing the paper on this as well. But essentially what we found was two clear clusters of employers. So those that we were calling, taking from Blois and Blackman's work, instrumentally engaged, so on a one-off kind of ad hoc basis, kind of picking and choosing programs or initiatives to be involved with. Maybe not recruiting, you know, at volume, maybe recruiting now and again, but at volume. So kind of a multitude of different types. But then we've got to the more relationally engaged as well, so deeper, systematic, sustained. And what we found from that as well was that it's the relationally engaged component that's important for the harder to help furthest from the labour market, that it's that's really key to getting employers really positively disposed to employing people who are further from the labour market. So then this is how it stacked up as well. So it was basically that the cluster of relational engagement in Denmark was twice that of the UK, and the relational engagement cluster in Denmark was broader, whereas in the UK it was really clear that it was made up of specifically apprenticeships, which is quite interesting in and of itself, wage subsidies or quasi-wage subsidies, because we don't have kind of what you call pure wage subsidies in the UK as such, and then pre-employment training as well. So that maybe speaks to a bit of your question actually, in trying to just define. Maybe that's a way that we need to develop it actually in thinking about this in terms of segmenting. Although when I was with the department the other day in Canberra, I was making the case for kind of going beyond that idea of just cohorts and actually looking at the individual. So you don't just present someone to an employer and say, well, you know, they're disabled or they've got housing issue, they fall into this cohort, but actually they're, you know, an individual with these skills and capabilities, and it just so happens that these are the barriers that they need to, or obstacles that they need to overcome. And then we're still working on this aspect in the paper that we're writing up, but we also asked employers to what extent they felt engaged or not engaged as well in programs during the interview process as well. And I still need to kind of work that through. And then just to summarise as well, the key, these are all in the reports we've done, by the way. We did a report on the survey, and we also did a report that was a final report, which was bringing together the qualitative interview findings and then joined together those with the survey findings as well, and some final recommendations for employers, government and providers. And actually one of my recommendations for the UK was to bring together skills and employability initiatives, which it seems that you've actually done in the UK, in Australia. So whereas in the UK, I've been told that's not what happened. So even though it seems we've got departments that kind of claim, you know, these are our customers, business department says businesses are ours, and DWP, whose goal ultimately is to service job seekers and businesses, you know, they're kind of fighting for the customers, if you like. Which seems a crazy way of delivering. So just a couple of things to point out here. Again, the membership of local regional business associations, I will come back to in the social network analysis, but that was key to employer engagement in the UK, but it wasn't the traditional business associations, it was various different formal and informal employer networks. And then maybe unsurprisingly, it was the collective agreement coverage in Denmark that was important. But one of the Danish providers that we've been engaged with actually found that quite a helpful finding, because they started to try and segment their employer offer to workplaces that had high collective agreement coverage in the Danish, so the workplace agreements, and that was something they'd not really thought of before. So although we thought this is really obvious, actually it did kind of inform their thinking on it. Importantly, employers in both countries didn't consider job seekers to be risky, or they weren't overly concerned about their unemployed status, but then we're talking here about the difference between intention and actual practice, right? So employers say this, but then especially when it comes to job seekers with disabilities, long-term health conditions, that clearly was something that employers were not doing, unsurprisingly. Main reason for participating in programs to give people a chance, that came out as the top reason. Main reason for not participating, satisfied with their current recruitment method, which really speaks to the importance of then the providers really making the case on the ground as to what their offer is to employers. And here is, I said I'd get back to the recruitment and selection aspect, so I think this is really, really important if we're thinking about active labour market programmes as the gateway to employment, and then thinking about progression, thinking about retention and progression. What we did was we did some statistical analysis that basically looks at the impact of agencies, so provider agencies as labour market intermediaries, and this is our sort of conceptual model that we tested. So we basically were looking at what's the impact of their activities versus firm size and employers' selection criteria. And what we found was that certainly in the early stages of the work programme, providers could get away with funneling large numbers of job seekers at large employers, because in all probability some of them would stick. So it's the approach in the recruitment sector that they call spraying and praying, which is not the best plan, to be honest, but you get rid of the low-hanging fruits, saying it in a horrible way, and then you kind of left with your harder to help. But we know that this obviously happens, that it's kind of getting people off the books who are easy to get off the books, and some of them, as I say, would be employed because they were funneling into large employers. And we knew from the evidence from providers and employers that this was the case. But once it came particularly to the harder to help, it was really employers' recruitment and selection processes that were getting in the way, because they are at root discriminatory, but there's a whole bigger piece of work, I think, to do on this, which we're starting to look at in terms of our work that's on inclusion, workplace inclusion, looking at how do we really hardwire inclusion beyond kind of equality and diversity, and that includes looking quite critically and constructively at recruitment and selection processes, at the job design. I mentioned the design of job roles at the CIPD conference recently, and nobody seemed particularly interested. I think it's just a bit too far away. But actually, I have heard it mentioned here while I've been here, maybe serendipity, but I just think we've maybe got a bit of a long way to go. And the providers on the ground, the individuals, need to be having those hard conversations with employers, like, you know, you're finding it difficult to recruit. Maybe you're not considering everybody who's out there in the labour, in the talent pool, but also maybe it's the way that you're constructing your job descriptions, you're excluding people, maybe it's the way that you're rolling out. The employers we talked to, they knew interviews were problematic. They knew they weren't the most effective recruitment method, but they didn't really know what to do instead. but some of them have made changes to their recruitment processes, which was really good to see, and actually gone for the more sort of values-based recruitment as well, which is really quite inclusive, and they found that that works really well for them. Like, I'm thinking of a contact centre that we spoke to that was medium-sized, that was, yeah, they turned their recruitment process on its head, and that worked really well, but they were really in the minority, unfortunately. And then we're just trying to get this published at the moment, just working on a revision. So we did a social network analysis. So this is, as I mentioned before, where the employer associations come in. And what the really critical takeaway from this is that employers in the UK, where providers could connect with them, once they got connected with a particular employer, they could then get access to a whole network of other employers, because actually in opposition to the Danish model, which maybe not what you'd expect, the network was more sparse in Denmark, but that wasn't an issue because the institutional context is pretty strong. But in the UK, the networks were really important. So once a provider could tap into an employer, they could then, if they did well with that, service employers' requirements, placed people in employment, and it all worked and it was great, then they could, in our statistical analysis, get access to other employers, whether it was part of your traditional employer associations or your kind of municipality-based, etc. And I'm just moving to the final few slides now, but just to recap, I think I've covered some of this I've prefigured some of it in terms of saying that our interview findings were concurred with the survey, and that employers were positively predisposed towards employing people who we see as kind of farther from the labour market, but they were very critical of the programmes offered, basically. So just going to the bottom, they were critical of the large numbers of programmes and providers, lack of information, didn't understand their value, hadn't got a clue how to access them at all. And I made this comment a few times actually, back when I worked in government, not for DWP but for a different government department. We had a skills strategy back in 2003, and the idea was that there would be no wrong door to the skills and employment system. But I think now it's a case of where is the door, not the wrong door, because that was just, employers just didn't know where to start. They used to have regional development agencies and business link, and that's all gone. So employers were telling us that they used to know where to go to get information, and Job Centre Plus also used to be a lot more kind of into their outreach as well, whereas they've had their funding massively cut. And I think now there's a question of whether they can really come back and whether they're actually being resourced enough in the public employment service to really provide to employers what they should be doing, really, to effectively support job seekers and employers. As I mentioned, the apprenticeships was really key. So there's an interesting point of learning, I think, in terms of the employers finding that was an effective recruitment channel, but it was also a way of developing talent in their organisation if they leveraged apprenticeships versus your kind of more of a work programme, kind of work first model approach. Importantly, but regardless of the size of the business, the decision to participate tended to be taken at local level of management. And as I've already sort of prefigured, it was the relationships that were really key to this, and then I'll focus on this in the last few slides. Single point of contact was important in a providing organisation, and having that sort of key relationship within the employer organisation as well. Employers had negative, really recent experiences of Job Centre Plus. Historically, their experiences have been a bit more positive, experiences of follow-up. Job Centre Plus were quite candid that they weren't resourced to follow up anymore. But effectively, what we see this as a product of conditionality as well, that people are just applying for jobs that there's no hope of getting or feeling pressured. But again, this hasn't gone down well when we say this to DWP. This is a just get really defensive, which I think is a shame, because the peak body for the industry also agrees with this, that this is not good for anybody, but it's quite hard, but I'll continue to make the case. As I mentioned about employing disabled candidates in particular, very few had done so, and when we talked about disability also, the focus was on the physical disability, but actually once we got talking to employers about disability, they understood disability more broadly from a personal perspective, but it was almost like there was a gap between that and their workplace experience. When it came to workplaces, they think of wheelchair access on the whole, but as I said, there were some exceptions. I've already mentioned recruitment and selection, but the key thing here that we keep saying over and over, and it seems to have been quite well received here so far. I'm glad to see. So maybe you're more switched on here, probably. Is that UK employers lack trust in public policies, really massively, just compared with Denmark as well. So what was needed was basically providers to fill in gaps on the ground, whereas Danish providers were kind of going in as a bit of warm leads in a way, so employers, it was really stark when we did the interviews, because the employers that we followed up, and then from the telephone sample, every single employer we talked to had taken part in at least one activation program, and they knew them by name and they knew all about them, but in the UK it was very sporadic. So really, it was those interpersonal relationships that were so critical, but also fragile, requiring nurturing. And then there's a kind of question of, which leads me on to the last couple of slides, really, about providing a balance between the business case for employers, or the CSR, social responsibility, social justice case. And the CSR, unsurprisingly, tends to be like larger employers. Social responsibility tended to speak more to the smaller employers. So it's just kind of different language, but different ways of conceptualizing the same thing. I'm going to just skip through this because this summarises what I've already said, but I just want to point to this, which is the co-opetition, which, as you'll no doubt be aware, unfortunately I didn't invent the phrase, the term. It's a really horribly inelegant word, but actually it seemed to be very important from our findings, was this idea of collaboration between providers. So when the sort of rule of thumb, as it was explained to us, was if an employer's requirements were greater than one provider could provide, that's when they should collaborate. And there is a kind of value net that comes along with the co-opetition theory. So I explored this with departmental people in Canberra last week about what's actually meant by co-opetition, how could this work in practice. And then this was the model that essentially providers, that kind of summarises it really. It's the personal contact with employers, it's the trust, and then there's the idea of right person first time. Employers would give them a second chance to get it right, but you're not going to get more than a second chance. And I think this last quote really, they all kind of speak to trust, but the thing about the relationship being viewed, you lose the trust, you lose the relationship, and if you've not got the employer, and therefore your engagement is zero, which I think really speaks to all of our findings. I'll come back to future plans if we get time. I don't know whether strangely not got my employer. We've developed a sales process model as well as part of this, but may or may not be relevant to our discussion, but it's basically ways of kind of augmenting this and going out basically prospecting employers to having conversations with them to suss out their requirements, importantly delivering on them. But I think we have my time. We've said enough, so we'll move to some questions. Thank you very much.